I have the pleasure of welcoming each and every one of us, both online and in the Steam House, for today's seminar. And it promises to be one of the very exciting seminars as we've usually experienced. So I wouldn't go much or talk much. I would immediately introduce our chair for today's seminar, Dr. W.E.B, who we are all aware of at the institution. She is a fellow at the Institute of African Studies, and she belongs to the History and Politics section. Dr. Ndiba, I hand over the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Not sure when it's coming. Technical difficulties. I am happy to be here and facilitating or moderating a very exciting seminar, which is right in my wheelhouse. Thank you, Dr. Hasiatu, for that very interesting introduction. So today we're going to hear from Dr. Donna Aza Weir Soley, who I apologize if I mispronounced her name.
The volume should go up.
You also know that. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about who she is, and then we'll tell you about what we're gonna talk about today. Dr. Donna Aza Weir Soley was born in St. Catherine, Jamaica, migrated to the US at 17. A Mellon Minority Fellow, Soley studied at Oxford University and is a published author and poet. She holds a PhD in English Literature Studies and is an associate professor at Florida International University. And I wonder if Dr. Genevieve Renza is online because she got her master's at Florida International University. So today we're going to hear about racialized trauma in the works of Derek Walcott and Toni Morrison. In this seminar, Dr. Aza Weir Soley explores the longing of people of African descent in the West to return to Africa, seeking their roots and a simpler life while facing racial and class disparity. Dr. Weir Soley discusses the contrasting views of Ghanaians who see the West as a site of wealth and progress. The historical figures of Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois are examined, highlighting their differing perspectives on a return to Africa. The impact of the slave trade on the mental anguish and displacement of Western Blacks is addressed, along with the portrayal of racialized traumas in literature by writers like Toni Morrison and Derek Walcott. In addition to her literary analysis, Dr. Aza Weir Soley will share her writing from her personal research on mental illness in Jamaican and Ghanaian communities and its relationship to racialized trauma in traditional Ghanaian culture. So I am sure you all know why I have been called to moderate this. You are still welcome, and you have 45 minutes to present. After such time, we will take 3 questions. You will respond, 3 questions, and you will respond. Please, the floor is yours, and welcome to the Institute of African Studies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frehi Watts. If you think you're bad at pronouncing names, but I will try my best. I just want to thank you as the seminar chair for inviting me to this event. I want to thank the director of the Institute, Dr. Samuel Ntibousu. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And of course, Dr. Abu Bakari, the senior research fellow, who is also the coordinator for the seminar. And last but by no means least, I want to thank my lovely mentee, Senora Edward, who has also been behind the scenes engineering this entire thing the entire time. Senora, I love you. You are an amazing mentee, and I am honored, right, to be your mentor. That was not last, so let me say thanks for those of you who came out this morning to hear me speak. I really appreciate your presence here. I appreciate the presence of those online as well. So I just want to say a general thank you to the Institute and to all of you who are here, as well as the technicians, and even the person who brought me water this morning. Everybody had a hand in making this possible. So I just want to thank everyone for welcoming me here. And I look forward to this conversation today. So first, let me say that the impetus for this came from a very personal place. However, Seth, who heads Walcott, has actually invited me to do a workshop and a reading on Saturday, and I will be saving my personal readings, my personal responses to mental health issues at that event. So I want to encourage you, if you're here, to come out for that event, and if you're not, if you're online, to tune in if it's possible to do so. The reason I did that is because I had to cut down, the stuff was just way too expensive. I also want to say before I start that it is not in my wheelhouse to discuss your culture and your dreams. It is in your wheelhouse. I'm more here to learn from you, to ask you questions, to do some research here as well, to find out, because my roots are Ghanaian and Nigerian. As you know, I'm from the diaspora, so my roots are Nigerian and Ghanaian, and I want to find out what it is about, what it is that I need to know, even the questions I need to be asking about mental health issues, how it's viewed in your context, in your cultural context, how it is handled, whether there are stigmas, as there are stigmas in Jamaica. It's more about me learning, because as an educator, I really believe that learning is not a one-way street. I don't believe in that top-down theory of learning. I think we are engaged in a learning community where we teach each other, because I learn as much from my students, especially in this age of technology. I certainly learn as much from my students as they learn from me. So I am under no impression that somehow knowledge is top-down. I don't think power should be top-down, and I don't think knowledge should be top-down. So I am actually here to learn from you. So I'm really interested in talking to you about these issues, to see what are some of the stigmas, what are some of the ways in which it is addressed. It should be more a conversation on that aspect of it than me coming here as if I'm somehow the expert on what happens in Ghana. No, I'm not. I am here to learn. I am a student. I'm a child of the diaspora, and I'm really interested in finding out for my own purposes, as well as for research purposes, for personal reasons, as well as for research purposes. So just so you know, that is the context. What I am an expert on, and will speak at length about, are the issues of mental health portrayal as an aspect of racial trauma within the literature and within the theories of some of our greatest thinkers and writers from the West, right? So to begin, trauma studies theorists such as Bessel van der Kolk and Rachel Yehuda maintain that trauma is carried in the DNA from one generation to the next. This means that events that occurred with the generations past are held in the body of their descendants and informs how they think and perceive, and even their health. Descendants of Holocaust survivors, as well as descendants of slaves and other groups that suffered collective trauma, are said to suffer mental, emotional, and physical effects despite never having lived these experiences themselves. Similarly, critical race theorists such as Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, Cornel West, and many more scholars who center race in their research maintain that institutions and systems do not transform overnight from bad actors to good without the ghosts of these bad actions lingering on in the system, clogging up the wheels of justice and stymieing social change. This is, in large part, the reason critical race theory is under such voracious attack from the far right in the USA today. Proponents of CRT hold that hundreds of years of slavery, followed by a long period of Jim Crow, America's own apartheid system, have left an indelible stamp upon all institutions and systems of American government and policies, which continue to impede social progress for African Americans. Now, opponents of CRT are very vocal, and some are high-powered individuals placed in positions to do great harm to anyone bold enough to make these claims. They maintain that race-based practices are obsolete and that we live in a colorblind society where individuals are given equal opportunities to succeed, regardless of race or gender or any other marginalized status. The Supreme Court of the United States recently made a decision to revoke affirmative action, and this is an example of such thinking made into law. If race is no longer a factor, then there is in school admissions or job promotions or access to social progress in general, then there is no need to put measures in place to legally protect Black Americans from prejudice and bias in school admissions, hiring, and elsewhere. However, those of us who are from marginalized communities anticipate with grave concern and trepidation the setbacks that our communities will experience due to the dismantling of affirmative action. Moreover, we all know that although some of these effects may prove difficult to measure and trace directly, over time, they will show up in our society in multiple and malign ways. When they do, the cause will not be traced back to this legal action and to this political moment, but to by the bad actors, but to some kind of Black pathology that further confirms their a priori beliefs that we were not deserving in the first place. Racial trauma carries within it all the hallmarks of other kinds of trauma, such as war, domestic abuse, abject poverty, and other conditions that degrade the human mind and body. Renowned psychiatrist Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book The Body Keeps the Score, uses research from modern neuroscience to demonstrate that trauma physically affects the brain and the body, causing anxiety, rage, the inability to concentrate, physical illness, and many other effects. Victims of trauma have trouble remembering, trusting, and forming relationships. He focuses mostly on war veterans, abused children, and victims of domestic violence and other violent crimes. But the effects of slavery, colonialism, and their aftermaths on New World Blacks both mirror and far outpace the effects of war and other tragedies. African-American psychiatrist Dr. Joy DeGree studies the specific effects of racial trauma on Blacks in America, and the conclusions she draws are startlingly similar to those drawn from Van der Kolk and others who study the effects of other forms of trauma. In her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, DeGree argues trenchantly and convincingly that although slavery has long been a part of human societies and human history, American chattel slavery represents a case of human trauma incomparable in scope, duration, and consequence to any other incidents of human enslavement. DeGree explains that post-traumatic slave disorder is a result of unresolved post-traumatic stress disorder arising from the experience of slavery, transmitted across generations down to the present day, along with the stress of contemporary racial prejudice, microaggressions, gaslighting, and other direct and subtle forms of racial animosity. However, long before anyone had linked the debilitating effects of social trauma on the individual and communities through science, some of the greatest thinkers ever produced in the African diaspora recognized the unlikelihood of the Black race thriving as a collective and achieving their full potential in Western nations that had built their world power branding upon Black subjugation and the physical and discursive violence of pernicious and long-standing racial othering. Chief among these thought leaders were, in the Black diaspora, were Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois, prodigal sons of Africa, whose names have come to mean as much here in Ghana as they do in the Black diaspora. Although they did not get along and their public feuding was no secret during their lifetimes, both have become synonymous in some ways with the Back to Africa movement for different reasons. Du Bois started out believing in the viability of assimilation, integration, equal rights, and full citizenship for Blacks in America. Garvey did not believe that the powerful elite, whites, would ever allow that to happen. He started his Back to Africa movement under the auspices of the Universal Negro Improvement Association so that Blacks could be given the opportunity to travel and potentially relocate or repatriate to Africa if they chose to do so. Although they both came to the realization that racial equality in the diaspora was a pipe dream. Through different pathways, both Garvey and Du Bois ended up believing that Africa held more hope for Black dignity, self-respect, and economic prosperity than the West. After being harassed by the US government for his communist views, Du Bois escaped to Ghana after his friend Nkrumah became president, and he eventually died here, never returning to live in the West. Garvey, similarly, harassed by the US government for his pro-Black activities, was deported to Jamaica after his movement was sabotaged by the FBI under the auspices of J. Edgar Hoover. Garvey believed that our biggest problem lay in our acceptance of mass narratives about Blackness being inferior. Thus, he cautioned us, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery, none but ourselves will free our minds. Garvey constantly reminded Blacks in the West that although slavery had succeeded in making us feel lost, displaced, unworthy, and untethered to the foundational norms that informed beingness for other humans, all we had to do to restore our sense of humanity was to recognize our past, understand our history, and take the necessary steps to restore what slavery had stolen from us. Garvey's message, people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots, was not meant to insinuate that slavery had not altered us in any way, nor that we had all been kings and queens in some mythical Edenic pre-slavery Africa before the long and inglorious descent into the hell of slavery and colonialism. Rather, that quote was supposed to encourage us to do the necessary archaeological work of excavating our origins and our traumatic history so we could build a counter-narrative strong enough to resist the interpolation of that powerful master narrative whose aim was to destroy any sense of humanity we still maintain. Similarly, W.E.B. Du Bois' views on double consciousness makes it clear that if America was incapable of reconciling two seemingly opposing concepts, Blackness and Americanness, that could only mean that the United States would never grant Blacks full and equal citizenship. Du Bois stated, "It is a peculiar situation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." He also stated that he simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. That's in Souls of Black Folks by Du Bois. From the above sentiments, it is clear to me that Du Bois wanted to believe in integration and assimilation. He developed the concept of the talented 10, which proposed that the elites from both races could work together to accomplish racial progress and integration. However, over time, he had to realize that it was simply not going to happen in his lifetime. Garvey, on the other hand, had prescience enough to know that it was not going to happen in any lifetime. Still, there are others who have taken the conversation much further than Du Bois and Garvey. Others who came after those two were able to see that time had not lessened the hold of the ideology of white supremacy upon the laws, policies, institutions, structures, and discourses that govern Black bodies in the West. They began to recognize that something sick was jamming up the operations, making the project of racial repair a near impossible feat. Garvey's message that none but ourselves can free our minds began to take on new meanings as we recognize just how completely we as Blacks had been interpolated from both inside and out by the conscious and unconscious bombardment of effective propaganda of Black inferiority. Frantz Fanon put it rather bluntly in psychoanalytic terms. Sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong. When they are presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable, called cognitive dissonance. And because it is so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit in with the core belief. Here, Fanon is recognizing the effects of racialized trauma and white supremacy upon the psyche of the Black subject. Schizophrenia is what Fanon describes here, a split in consciousness brought about by the fact that we had not only fallen in love with our captors, but we had begun to believe that their propaganda about our worthlessness and their superiority. It is the core belief. If the core belief is that whiteness is superior and Blackness is a curse, how can those of us who are non-white ever expect to repair what Toni Morrison calls our sense of self-regard? Fanon recognized that what the West had done to its colonial and enslaved subjects was to rob them of their very humanity by making them believe that they were unworthy of being let fully into the human family. Fanon says that same Europe, where they were never done talking about humanity, never stopped proclaiming that they were only anxious for the welfare of humanity. Today, we know with what sufferings humanity has paid for every one of their triumphs of the mind. Therefore, Fanon rejects the humanism proclaimed in Europe. Based on colonization, exploitation, slavery, and violence, European humanism dehumanizes. He rejects what is central to European humanism, profit and the reduction of the human to outputs in production. Siding with the workers of the world, most of whom are non-white and marginalized, Fanon states, if conditions of work are not modified, centuries will be needed to humanize this world, which has been forced down to animal level by imperial powers. Another contemporary of Frantz Fanon, Derek Walcott, was a St. Lucian poet and playwright and one of the most important literary trailblazers in the Caribbean. Derek Walcott won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1992 for the literary merits of his body of work, which included poetry, essays, and plays. Arguably, one of Walcott's biggest contributions to Caribbean thought was the idea that our Caribbean hybridity is a form of schizophrenia that can be utilized for creative purposes. Thus, he urged the Caribbean artists to make creative use of his schizophrenia, an eclectic fusion of the old and the new. The Caribbean, that's in the Caribbean culture of mimicry. Such cultural schizophrenia, Walcott states, is permanent in all countries that have been colonial. It is a shadow, a kind of meridian, a crossing that has to be examined. However, are these claims made by Walcott purely metaphors, or does he deploy the language of the mental health field deliberately and instructively to contextualize the splitting consciousness that derives from the experience of slavery and colonialism? In Walcott's play, Dream on Monkey Mountain, the character Matap is a poverty-stricken madman who lives in the forest and believes he has been called to lead his people out of bondage. And back to Africa. Powerful enough as metaphor, Matap's brand of madness is representative of the psychological breakdown that occurs when someone is completely displaced, fragmented, and stripped of his humanity by forces so powerful that they are able to render the victim an accomplice in his own debasement. This is what it means to be a good colonial subject, to fall in love with your captors like victims of Stockholm Syndrome. Walcott's governing metaphor for Caribbean hybridity is often troped through madness, dividedness, or splitness of consciousness. Like the typical colonial subject, the character Macabre is conflicted. For example, he smiles when he claims his religion as Catholicism, a European religion, but he's also keenly aware of his poverty, his abjection, and the debasement of his humanity under colonial rule. He's divided, as Walcott said, Caribbean subjectivity. But it is not just dividedness that the character feels. His angst is not a private and self-indulgent obsession with identity. Macabre's very being is being threatened with erasure from the state that refuses to acknowledge his existence as fully human. Derek Walcott describes himself as a mongrel because he is of mixed race Caribbean. He's a mixed race Caribbean man of African and European extraction, perhaps with Asian influences as well. But his character Macabre is fully Black and sees himself not as a mongrel, but as a vagabond, a homeless citizen of nowhere, whose only anchor is a mystical Africa that is vague, unknown, yet desirable, like a woman who is too far above him to be attainable. Dream on Monkey Mountain starts with the characters Suris and Tigre in a jail cell, a holding place for slaves in most slave narratives. Jails were built to punish slaves as well as to house them in between masters after they were sold. It is commonplace in slave narratives to find even small children sent to jail in order to punish their parents. In Dream on Monkey Mountain, the jail is a place of shame. The Greek chorus in the play sings a Caribbean song, Mama, your son in the jail already. Take a towel and ban your belly. Walcott's character Macabre, the putative king of Africa, arrives in the jail cell and is mocked by Corporal Lestrade. Macabre was arrested for being drunk and disorderly and for mashing up Alcindor's cafe. In his bag, Macabre has a bottle of rum and a carnival mask with a white face and long black silver hair, reminiscent of Frantz Fanon's book, Black Skins, White Masks, which links the alienation of the colonial subject from himself as demonstrably tethered to the physical and psychological violence of colonialism. Because of this link, many critics associate the mask in Macabre's bag as a representation of his divided consciousness and the fragmentation of his identity as a colonial subject. We see evidence of the massive discourse of colonialism that is used to keep Blacks in their places of subjection under Corporal, when Corporal addresses Tigre and Souris. Corporal says, animals, beasts, savages, cannibals, stop turning this place into a stinking zoo. He then unleashes a string of racialized epithets upon them that derives from caricatures and stereotypes that Europeans created to define Blacks as inferior. Blacks are animals who turn even a jail cell into something worse, a zoo, only fit for animals like them. The corporal, a representative of the colonial masterclass, a gatekeeper for whiteness, a kind of overseer or steward of white power and authority, continuously links Blackness with inferiority. On page 217, the corporal continues with his racist diatribe. God looked at his handiwork and saw that it was good. For some of the apes had straightened their backbone and started walking upright. But there was one tribe, unfortunately, that lingered behind, and that was the nigger. Here, Walcott deploys the corporal as a mouthpiece to amplify the inferiorizing discourse that renders Blackness as non-human in the white imaginary. The casualness of the corporal's insults mirror the entrenchment and pervasiveness of that constant dehumanization that over time reduces the Negro in the West to a shell of a person with little self-worth. Macaque's attempt to resist this erasure is narrativized as a descent into madness, a complete split reality, because he begins to think he's an African king and savior of his people. But when you take a deeper look at what Macaque's reality is composed of, the split seems saner than the alternative. Well, the alternative would be what? Passive acceptance of self-annihilation? On page 217, the chorus sings a Christian song called When the Roll is Called Up Yonder, and declares that no one in that jail cell will be going to heaven because you're all too Black, thus indicating that not even God wants Black people, a sentiment that was very commonplace amongst white slave owners who discouraged their slaves from participation in the Christian religion since they had no souls worth saving. I'm going to run through this rather quickly because of time issues, but I want to say that Macaque, when asked his name, he says, I am tired, indicating that he's tired of being racialized rather than humanized. When asked where he lives, he says he lives on Monkey Mountain. Monkey Mountain is a free forest space that is kind of like a reprieve for Macaque. It's kind of this liminal space, you know, that is kind of like an escape from colonialism in a sense, because it's so far away in the bush that British law doesn't really hold there. The laws of nature are more prevalent there, but part of the reason that Macaque is seen as a madman is because he has this dream that a woman in the moon speaks to him. And the woman in the moon says to him, you are a descendant of kings and lions. Your lineage is a lion lineage in Africa, so you should be strong. You have the power to lead your people. And so Macaque, that vision allows him to kind of relieve himself of the state of abjection he was in and become more purposeful and more proud of his origins. And so that is also seen as a sign of madness because, oh, you know, Africa is being romanticized. But my contention is that it's necessary. The negritude movement created this elevation of Africa as a way of making sure that Blacks had something to hold on to, something to elevate them, to lift them out of this state of abjection, because for the slaves, we don't come from anywhere. We don't have a past. We don't have a history. We don't have a people. We don't have a language. We don't have a tongue. We don't have a food. We don't have anything, right? That can anchor us. So to anchor us to a place and then to elevate that place and say, yeah, this place is not just a place it's not just a primitive place that's in the white imaginary. It's also a place of culture. It's also a continent, right? It's not a country, as they made it appear. It's actually a continent, and there are different peoples on that continent and different histories, different cultures on that continent, right? And so there's something for you to be proud of. It was a way of giving them something that they could hold on to, something that would anchor them in their sense of dignity that they're trying to restore, right? So, but what I call a misreading of the woman, of the white woman, is a misreading that a lot of critics attach to this dream, this play in this book, Dream on Monkey Mountain, is that she's a white woman. And that to be Macaque's attachment to her is really a celebration of white womanhood. Now, my contention is, how do we know that she's a white woman? Because she belongs to the moon. But Macaque never actually says she's a white woman. Macaque says she lives on the moon. And she's a moon lady, right? And she lives on the moon. Now, there is a moon lady that Sanyara, can you show that figure for us? From Chinese culture. And since it is Walcott who talks about the hybridity of Caribbean culture, I want us to kind of focus a little bit on that. So I think it's this one, Shang. Chango, she's called Shange, Shango, Shana, who's a moon lady who actually was the wife of an archer. And the archer, because of some brave feats that he did in China, he was given the elixir of immortality. And Shange wanted to have immortality. So she stole the elixir, drank it, and became immortal and flew to the moon, partly to escape her husband, right? And the community, who would have been very upset that she stole the elixir, but also because she now had the power of flight and she was able to fly to the moon. So she celebrated in China in the autumn festival, in the Mid-Autumn Festival. And her name, she's sometimes called Shango, sometimes called Shangye, sometimes I see her represented as China. When I first met her was through literature, the Joy Luck Club that I teach, and she was called China, the Moon Lady, right? And so they also do give her cakes and sweets as offerings, right? So my contention is, how are we so sure that this China, the Moon Lady, has to be a white woman, a European woman? My contention further is that why have we allowed Europeans to colonize the color white? Does white only mean European? Isn't there white that exists in nature and color all around us? Doesn't white exist for other purposes besides as a metonymy and a metaphor for European? Because in making China, or in making the lady that he sees a white woman, what the critics effectively do, and what the detractors of Macaque in the book, right, effectively do, is to make him beholden to whiteness in a kind of fetishizing sexual way. So to problematize it, to undercut the message that she's giving him, which is a really important message, which is straighten up your back, stand on your own 2 feet. You come from somewhere, you come from a proud lion lineage. So you see all of this reference to him being a monkey by Corporal Lestrade, and she has replaced the monkey, right, with the lion, which I think is a very positive progression, if you will, right? So at the end, by the end of the play, Macaque has lost a lot of his supporters. He has lost a lot of his followers. He's been betrayed by Moussi, who is his second in command. And so now he has actually bought into this counter discourse that is meant to destabilize his purpose, which is to say, your vision is what is crazy. Not what is happening to you here, but your vision is crazy. And part of the reason it is crazy and not reliable is because it's attached to this woman who is a white woman. And so you're just fetishizing white women. And that is part of our sickness in the Caribbean, is that we fetishize whiteness and we fetishize white womanhood. And so I have a long discourse about that I can't get into, but I just wanted to tell you briefly that piece of it so you understand how it ends, is that it ends with him not being able to continue his mission, because really at the end of the day, he becomes undermined and he loses confidence in himself because he's been told that his vision is a false vision by this white woman who is a devil and so on, right? I want to switch really quickly, if I may, to Toni Morrison's work, because Toni Morrison is another figure, another writer from the African diaspora, who is a Nobel laureate as well. And madness is recognized as a defining trope in her body of work. In her first novel, The Bois, Morrison's character, Pecola Breedlove, is impregnated by her father, Charlie Breedlove, and rejected by her mother and her community. Pecola descends into madness as a way of protecting herself from the ravages of sexual abuse and also from the hatred heaped upon her for her very Black skin, even by her own people. Her family's poverty and their alienation from the community mark her as an outsider and create the conditions for her sexual abuse. Toni Morrison narrates Pecola's father as a sympathetic figure, even though he's a predatory rapist, something that really got my goat. She makes it clear that he is damaged goods because of the rejection he experienced as a child from his parents and the culture of Southern racism in which he grew up. When Charlie was a young man having his first consensual sexual experience in the woods with a young lady, they were discovered by two white men who were out hunting. These men transformed what was a happy consensual encounter into a traumatizing experience by forcing Charlie to perform for their amusement. He was humiliated, as was the young lady. But since he had no power to retaliate against white men with guns, he decided to hate the young Black woman instead. Shifting racial animus from white male perpetrators to Black female victims became a formative feature of Charlie's psychological makeup. His relationship to all women was shaped by this experience, and so he treated his wife with contempt. And when he found out that he had fatherly love for his daughter, it confused him. Non-sexual love was not something Charlie knew anything about. Morrison makes it clear that race predetermined all of Charlie's actions from boyhood to manhood. She also underscores the point of Charlie's psychological fragmentation and insanity that he passed on to his daughter, not just in his DNA, but also in his assault upon her body and mind. The novel ends with the daughter wandering about the neighborhood in a state of disassociation after giving birth to a stillborn child that was her father. So that's one of the ways that Morrison narrativizes insanity in her novel, because that is insanity. In her novel, Sula, Morrison also has another character called Shadrach, who invents a National Suicide Day to recognize and celebrate death. Shadrach returns from World War II shell-shocked with PTSD. This is brought about as much by the trauma of war that he was fighting in Europe as by the trauma of racialized rejection that he experienced as a veteran in the United States Army. Shadrach's disassociation is tied to his recognition that in Europe, he's fighting a war for other people's freedom when he has no freedom within the United States, because this is during the Jim Crow apartheid era in the United States. He has no freedom, but he's fighting a war for someone else's freedom. You can imagine the disassociation that this causes, right? He retires to the bushes when he returns to live out his life in isolation from its community as a way of protecting them from its hallucinations and frequent schizophrenic breaks of reality. And he institutes National Suicide Day to get the community to celebrate, record, and recognize death, because he believed that one should always be prepared for the inevitable, right? And death was the only thing he felt was real and constant that he could depend on. The main character, Sula, shows that the gendered and racialized traumas in the same book that Black women deal with are different in some ways from what the men face. Unlike Shadrach, Sula's insanity was instantiated by her refusal to live by the codes of respectability for a Black woman in her society. Sula, an unmarried woman, slept with whomever she felt like sleeping with, and it drew contempt from her community. The men, on the other hand, who have the same sexual proclivities, are not condemned at all, nor are they ostracized and alienated from family and friends. In fact, their sexual prowess is celebrated, and they're seen as heroes and role models to other men and young boys. Sula's actions are seen as insane and antisocial because they do not conform to expected gender roles. Ultimately, she's also shunned by the community because she also does not conform to the expectation that she should take care of her grandmother in her old age. So Sula becomes a pariah in the community, first for her sexual indiscretions, and secondly, for her refusal to accept the role of nurturer and caregiver assigned to women in the Black community. So you see two different characters who then become ostracized and are seen as insane, but for very different reasons, right? So I'm going to skipping quite a bit. I will probably go back to some of this in the Q&A. Beloved is another Morrison novel where racialized trauma is ubiquitous in the narratology. Critic Roger Luckhurst says that Toni Morrison's novel is a formative text in literary trauma studies. Let me repeat that, a formative text in literary trauma studies. It's like she set the bar for literary trauma studies, right? With Beloved. This is because Morrison's Beloved is a historical fiction that centers a series of themes and tropes that are foundational to the slave narrative genre. Based on a historical character by the name of Margaret Garner, an escaped slave woman of the 19th century who decided to kill her children rather than have them return to slavery, Beloved is Morrison's most celebrated and most critiqued novel. There are hundreds of thousands of essays in literary criticism on Beloved. Slave narratives are familiar with the deeply disturbing patterns of abuse, psychological, emotional, physical, sexual, financial, and all that permeates narratives of enslavement. But for folks who do not read slave narratives, Beloved can give you nightmares. In Beloved, the main character, Sete, succeeds in killing her crawling already baby when her master comes to take her back to slavery. Determined to kill all 4 of her children rather than have them return to slavery, Sete succeeds in killing only one before she's caught. The novel begins with Sete's house being haunted by the spirit of this little girl who was angry and vengeful. She eventually morphs into a human figure of a teenage girl who was the same age she would have been had she lived. Everyone in the household, including her mother, her sister Denver, and Sete's lover Paul D, are forced to deal with Beloved's excessive neediness, her treachery, her deep anger. Like a succubus spirit, she attempts to suck the life out of everyone in her attempt to right the wrong that was done to her. Beloved is a polyvalent signifier within the text, in that she represents multiple and complex thematic and ideological concepts in the narrative. But one of the main things written about by critics is that she represents the spirit of slavery that still haunts New World blacks. Beloved then is a symbol of the pain and trauma that we carry in our DNA that are directly related to the ravages of slavery and its aftermath of continuous oppression, alienation, criminalization, displacement, and othering, and the constant reminder that as a group, we are neither wanted, respected, nor celebrated in the West, despite the outstanding contributions of some of our brightest and best to the greatness of those countries. Furthermore, even some of our most liberal institutions are still haunted, whether directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, by the ghosts of slavery, colonialism, Jim Crow, and other racialized laws, policies, procedures, and discourses that unfairly targets Blacks in the West, stymieing, obstructing our social progress, and making it impossible to heal from racialized trauma as a collective. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we can do better than that. Let's give Dr. Donna Aza Weir Soley a resounding congratulations. I am sure you all will agree with me that this is a very impactful, thought-provoking, forward-looking presentation. And so without further ado, I'm going to open it to comments. For those in the room, throw up your hand as we usually do. For those online, please signify that you want to make a comment by raising your hand. We're going to take a few comments, 2 comments in the room, and then we'll go online and we'll allow our presenter to respond. Any comments in the room? Okay, we have one. Please, before you speak, state your name and your association at all.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Senora Lynn Edward. I am a PhD student at CUNY Graduate Center. I'm here today as a guest as well to watch this seminar, and I had it's comments, so not questions, just comments. So I wanted to say that I found the piece regarding maybe the appropriation or misappropriation of the color of whiteness to like the subsuming of whiteness as a racial identity to be very interesting, just because in discussions that I've been able, luckily with the privilege to have with you, there's this sort of attachment that whiteness as a racial identity gets to have to all things that are pure. And then what happens is we then, whenever we're doing our sort of analysis, have to turn away from whiteness, but then it kind of erases the connection that the African diaspora has to the color and the celebration and the beauty that the whiteness can have and the purity that Blackness can inherently have, because all that is, whole and beautiful can also be Black and can be considered that way. So I appreciated that, because I think that like the moon and, the stars and all of these things that we can just sort of like give away to whiteness can and should be reconsidered in the cosmologies of the African diaspora and the importance of whiteness as a color and as a meaning of metaphor. So I appreciated that. And I wanted to thank you for such a rich discussion on trauma across literature. And I think it's really important with like what mental health crises we have across the diaspora today, that you're creating this conversation to bring in understanding of trauma into literature, because a lot of times people divorce psychology from literature and think of them as disciplines that don't have intersection. So I feel like your work is very intersectional and is really needed for this present time, as we're really trying to understand ourselves more psychologically as a people, as African people, African descent people. So thank you for that.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for that comment. Do we have any other questions or comments in the room? And if we have about 30 minutes to discuss, if I'm not correct. So if we can just shorten our comments a bit, just so that everyone has an opportunity to speak. While those in the room are collecting their thoughts, I'm going to call on Professor S.C. Sullivan Azi online. Prof, please open your mic and go ahead and raise your comments.
Thank you very much.
Please, Prof, we can't hear you well, so can you increase your volume?
Can you hear me now? My volume is at the highest level, though. Can you hear me?
Just a moment, Prof. We're having technical difficulties. Give us 30 seconds.
Okay.
And after Prof goes, we'll have Kwesi go also and speak. Please, are we ready?
Just a second.
Yeah, we all can hear her online, but we're struggling to hear her in the room. Okay, we're ready, Prof.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for this lecture. I had found Derek Walcott very, very dense. And you really helped me through, trying to understand the kind of symbolism that he was and storytelling that he was trying to put together. I just was wondering whether you could share any criticisms of his approach that you've come across, and maybe comment on that criticism. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. We'll take one more and then we'll come to our presenter. Kwesi, I think your hand is up. Please, will you open your mic and speak?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're here very well.
All right, thank you very much. So just to say that I've always been intrigued with Fanon's work, and then also usually looking at Marima Ani's terminology of Marfa, to basically look at the trauma that we've had to deal with. And my question basically has to do with, particularly for some of us young learners, what should we do moving forward in managing or unearthing such trauma, and then also really looking at futures. I mean, I'm currently based in a a university in the global north. And when you meet certain students, I mean, I have colleagues, PhD students from different parts of the world, and you realize the extent of ignorance that people basically have of Africa, and this kind of, but being in such spaces, you actually shine some light on it, because they are the heritages that we've inherited on both sides. There are even professors who are so ignorant about a lot of things. So when you shine like some light, they're all talking about projecting the universalizing tendencies of scholars in the global north. And then suddenly you ask a simple question and they're just wondering, I never thought about this. Because they've inherited something and we have also inherited something. And it's basically this challenge. What do we do with such different levels of inheritance? What should we do in fostering futures that would be really appropriate for all of us? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We're now going to turn it over to our speaker who will respond.
Thank you so much for both of those questions. What's the first question? Prof. Sutherland Addy, thank you for your question. What I've encountered in terms of criticism of Walcott's approach is really the focus on, for some people, the focus on hybridity kind of undercuts the Afrocentricity of some scholars, right, who want to focus on Africa and less on the sense of fragmentation and schizophrenia or mixedness, but because of who he is, right, because of what he embodies in his own genealogical makeup, I think he has to do that. But I also think that he is correct in that our cultures in the Caribbean, our cultures in the diaspora are mixed. We are mixed. We are mixed. And there are ways in which some of us try to romanticize Africa in ways that are, a little bit problematic. We're not all descended from kings and queens, right? So that's problematic. And so I've seen the critique of his work being, he doesn't centralize Africa, it doesn't centralize Blackness in the way that some people would like him to do. But I think that the place that he's coming from is a good one because he raises questions and kind of forces you, because the work is dense, so it's easy sometimes to miss that, I think. But if you read Dream on Monkey Mountain, you will see that he's questioning our love of whiteness for the characters. So I don't think that that's something that I would accuse him of. I think he just complicates the issue because it is a complicated issue. And that's what he's trying to say, is that we are already interpolated by all of those discourses and master discourses about, Blackness and whiteness, and that we can't pretend that doesn't happen by somehow replacing all of that in one fell swoop with this idea that we're all from African royalty, right? I think he has a point to make there. And I think it's really important to recognize the multiplicity of cultures that go into creating those of us who are in the West. That's important. That's more important for some people than others. It's less important for me because I look like an African woman, so I don't have to do anything else than be one, right? But for other people, I have cousins who actually have to, who can pass for white, and for them, it's a different situation. So your positionality, I think, makes a difference in that also. So I don't necessarily find that critique of his approach is valid, but I do find that the critique of the density of his work and the fact that you can miss some of what he's trying to do in the work is a valid critique. But that's because the work is dense. I guess that's why he won the Nobel Prize, because he's a very complex writer and a very complex thinker. So I hope that answers your question. I don't know if that was the direction you wanted me to go in, but I was trying my best to cover it. Now, with respect to the second speaker, Kwesi Amwa, I think I know Mariana Ani. I think I know the work that you're talking about with MAFA. And your question about what should we do with managing our trauma is really, I feel like, one of the most important questions I could be asked, because that is what I'm trying to figure out. What should we do with this trauma? I think my first step is right here in Ghana. I want to find out why we don't recognize mental illness unless a person is raving mad on the street, right? And when we do recognize it, why we stigmatize it the way we do. I understand from the colonial perspective. I would like to understand it from the pre-colonial perspective. What are some of the ideations that we have about mental health? I know some of the ones we have in Ghana may be similar to what we have in Jamaica, like, it's a bad spirit that's riding you or something. Somebody set a bad spirit on you, or, you basically need an exorcism. So to put it in European terms, because that's not what we would call it, right? You need a cleansing or something, right? That it needs to, that the spirit in you is bad and it needs to be taken out. Well, I think that's a metaphoric way, right, of looking at it, that there is a bad spirit indeed, right? If you are alienated from the self, there is indeed a bad spirit within you that needs to be taken out. But I think our first step is to destigmatize mental illness, which I think we do across cultures. And I would like to understand why we do it in Ghana. If we did it in Ghana before, since I'm a diaspora subject, did we do that in Ghana before colonialism? I'm really here to ask that question. Seriously, I'm doing research. I'm really here to ask the question. Did we do that in traditional cultures? Did we stigmatize it? One, and two, how did we deal with it when we had to resolve it? If we had to resolve those issues, because let me tell you something, the West is not having a lot of success with mental health issues. So that's not the place to look. It's not medicine. That's not working. So where do we go? Maybe we have to return to some of the ways that if it worked before. As far as I'm concerned, I'm practical. Whatever works, whatever works. So how do we address it? How do we address this issue? That's the question. I don't have the answer for you, but I think it's a really important question. And I think we can start with destigmatizing this issue and then see if we can move from there to figure out what are some of the solutions that we should have. And part of the reason I'm presenting this research in the way that I'm doing it is to show us that it's almost inevitable not to be crazy in the system in some way or the other. How do you manage to avoid that? What kind of voodoo do you have to work to not be crazy in a system that's created to make you crazy? That is so much more powerful than you, the individual. When it's piled on institutional, systematic, on top of one another, how can you not have a mental break? I think it's the fact that we are not running mad, throwing poop that should be celebrated, right? That's the wonder, that we're strong enough, that we can survive it. That's the wonder, not the fact that it exists. That should not come as a surprise to any of us, which is why we need to destigmatize it, to say, hello, this system is created to make you lose your mind. So if you're holding on to your mind, you are already winning, right? Forget about being rich. If you're holding on to your mind, you are already winning.
Thank you so much. So that was a very powerful response. We have two more questions. And then for folks in the room, if you have a question, raise, your hand. I know we're digesting this, we're thinking about it, we're trying to put it in our context. So don't take the lack of sort of pointing questions as not interested or whatever. We're really thinking through this, right? Individually and collectively. And I think this thinking has raised a couple of questions online. And I also have a question. So one question from Professor Asita Glenadi again is, being here in Ghana, you must have noticed that there is insufficient understanding of the complexity of the trauma brought on by colonialism and enslavement. How do we bridge that gap? So that's one sort of question. And then Dr. Salah J asked, can you elaborate on integration of indigenous healing and African spiritual beliefs? Just a second, and here it is. Into biomedical healthcare in treating mental health issues. I'm interested in transcultural psychiatry, so we should connect after your presentation. Thanks for your powerful presentation. And I'll add, and then other folks in the room, please, you can bring in your conversation. I want, there's a couple of things that you said that just sort of, stuck with me or made me think and really kind of process. And I'll raise those things and then come into a question. The first question is the connection of Du Bois' double consciousness with this sense of self-regard, and then interestingly splitting consciousness, right? That arises with colonialism and slavery, and one could even contend neocolonialism, right? The era in which we're living. And then there's this notion of, divided consciousness, Blacks or Black people or African people in this place of subjugation, right? So these three things really kind of stood out to me. And then when I started to process it, we're sort of reflecting back on this notion of, centering colonialism or Europeans, even in our conversations about liberation and agency, right? And so as you're speaking about the trauma, whether it's post-traumatic slave syndrome, whether it's post-colonial, syndrome, post-colonialism syndrome, the effects of slavery on one's DNA and its relationship sort of to mental health and double consciousness, I'm just kind of, thinking, is centering Europe and Europeans and whiteness, is that part of this problem? It almost seems like centering those that oppress you in order to then de-oppress yourself. To me, it's problematic, right? It's suggesting that you, sorry to say if this has happened to anyone, but perhaps a woman who has been raped, centering the rapist in order for them to heal. That doesn't seem like a correct way to heal, right? It seems that one should identify the rapist, in this case, the slaver or the colonialist, acknowledge that and then heal holistically without centering those that have oppressed or repressed you. So I don't know if it's a question, I don't know if it's a comment, I don't know what it is, it's something. Do we have any more comments or something from the audience in the room? Yes, we have one more. We have three. Let's take a fourth, get ourselves a round out program. And please, can you make it brief because we want to give our
really
thank you.
Hi, I wanted to just ask for you to speak as a Black woman, specifically a woman of the diaspora. Can you speak to how you feel gender impacts this? And because I think specifically in the West, when you think about movements like Black Lives Matter, when we think about things around like decriminalization and justice work, a lot of it centers the Black male experience. And so even then mental health is brought into sort of a centering of Black males' mental health and the breaking that slavery does in the Black male psyche. But if I just wanted to know from your literary expertise and your experience personally as a Black woman, how you feel this coincides for like in terms of gender, and maybe with the background from Lord, we could talk about like how mental health is particularly impacting the slave woman or the Black woman presently.
Thank you all so much. Well, Dr. Prehiwa, I think I'll try to answer your comment / question / not sure what this is first, because I think it's a really good one. And if you notice, I'm trying to decenter whiteness as European in Walcott's work, because that is the way most critics attack the work. Is that this is about a white woman, and part of his sickness is that he's in love with this white moon woman. Right? And my contention is whiteness, the moon. That's why I found somebody outside of European culture, right? I couldn't find a goddess who lived on the moon in African culture. So if you can find one, please send her my way. I couldn't find one, but I found a Chinese one. And since Walcott's focus is on hybridity and on the fact that we're mixed culture, right, in the region, I thought, okay, so he mentions Asian culture has been a part of Caribbean culture as well. So let's bring in that, because she's the one I'm most familiar with, because I was introduced to her through teaching the literature of Amy Tan called Joy Luck Club. And there was this China, this moon woman, and I was like, who is she? I've never heard of her. But there's a lot about Chinese mythology that I've never heard of. So I just took that one in. And so when I read her in Walcott, I thought, I wonder if Walcott is doing something with that. But I noticed no mention of her was made in the book, and no mention of her was made in the criticism or anything like that. So I started to attach her to other figures from the natural world, or other figures in Yoruba, for example, like Oshun and Yemiya, who are nature deities, who are attached to nature. Just like the moon is nature. But I didn't know of one in that context that was from the moon. So I ended in their water spirits, right? They're water deities. She's a moon deity. And I thought it doesn't have to be a white woman. Also, in African religion, they use white for spiritual purposes, right? You wear white for spiritual purposes about purity. The concept of whiteness as purity, the problem is that concept pre-existed European, and they colonized it. And it's time for us to take it back. Why do we give up everything and say, oh, okay, so now whiteness, all things good are white, that's your opinion. Who says they're white? They don't look white like this paper to me. You can't just, they can't just colonize a word and then all of us, apparently they can, because they did. And then all of us are like, oh, that must be what it means. So you cannot mention the moon, a woman in the moon, without, even though the moon is a real thing that exists in nature, you can't mention that without it being a white woman. It can't be any other kind of woman. And how is it that this white woman is invested with all this knowledge to try to empower this Black man that he was a king and he's a lion? It's like, where's all of that, right? And so the way that they look at it in the criticism, I find that highly problematic. It is centering whiteness. But what I am doing is not centering whiteness. It's centering trauma. It's centering the trauma. That is the source of the trauma. Racialization is the source of the trauma, but what we are trying to center in this conversation is the actual trauma. That's a real thing. Now, if you were raped and you have to deal with that, you have to go to therapy, you have to talk about the rape. Do you have to mention that there was a rapist involved? Yes. That's only logical. But you don't have the whole conversation about him. Your conversation after that point is now I am traumatized. How do I deal with that? Right? That is centering the trauma. It's important because the problem, I think, is that we have not done that enough. We haven't centered the trauma. We have kind of acted like, oh, well, it's over. And we hear that in the United States. We hear that in the West a lot. Slavery's over. You're no longer slave. Get over it. Move on. And part of the problem, I don't know if you're familiar with critical race theory, and the whole conversation about it by the right in the West now, but it's this idea that it has remained in the system, that it has remained, that although the apartheid in the United States, the Jim Crow ended, slavery ended, the apartheid ended, and it ended, I think, fairly recently, I mean, in Martin Luther King's time. It didn't end in Garvey's time, right? And so, yes, there's still vestiges of it. I call it the ghost in the system. It's still there, clogging up, stymieing, right? The progress we're supposed to make. Hence the reason why they can elect Barack Obama, but they can also undercut him, undermine him, and not allow him to have any power because he didn't have control, you know, of the full control of the House and the Senate, that all of the policies that he wanted to pass, many of them could not get passed. They also made fun of him. They made fun of his wife. They ridiculed him. The way they treated him was not with respect. So although we respect him and we know he's deserving of respect, he didn't always get it. As a matter of fact, the backlash that came after him was Donald Trump. As if to say, okay, this is what you get for electing a Black president. We're going to roll it all the way back, right? And not Trump in of himself, right? As a figure, right? Not him of himself, but what he stirred within the far right and the people who he was able to then amplify their voices. And we're finding out, whoa, America is far more racist today than it was, as far as we knew, when Barack Obama was elected. Right? It's like, how did that happen? It's like we have to be punished for making that step forward. So now we have to take several steps backwards because of that. And we're in danger of becoming a fascist country, right? That's the danger. Because we took that step forward. That is scary. So clearly, this is a conversation that needs to be had. So the second question, sorry, what was that? Essie Sutherland, okay, Essie Sutherland. Being here in Ghana, you must have noticed that there is insufficient understanding of the complexity of the trauma brought on by colonialism and enslavement. How do we bridge the gap? I haven't been here long enough, Essie. I just got here a few days ago and I was trying to finish out this paper. So no, I did not notice that there is insufficient understanding, but that's why we participate in a knowledge community, right? So we can share knowledge. I have insufficient understanding about Ghana. That's a bit of an understatement, right? I have a lot of insufficient understanding, and I'm here to learn as well. So the way I see it, if I'm here to learn, I'm also here to teach. It's a two-way street. So we have conversations, and that's how we bridge that gap. We talk, we bridge that gap, we break bread. That's how I'm just a child of the diaspora, but that's how I was taught to do it in Jamaica.
Okay, thank you.
Big up Jamaica, gotta big up my country. Oh, I did know this essay that we love Jamaica here. I got in the taxi and the taxi driver was only playing reggae. I said, I'm in Ghana, I want to hear Ghana music. He said, I don't listen to Ghana music, I only listen to reggae. I had to go home and text everybody that night, like, hello. They love us here. That's a beautiful thing. Okay. Questions? Good point. Can you elaborate on integration of indigenous healing and African spiritual beliefs into biomedical healthcare in treating mental health issues? What a great question. That is Sila Ajay. Sila. That's an amazing question, Sila. I love it. I come from Maroons in Jamaica. So my people also practice African healing, African ways of healing. So that's a part of my DNA as well. So that's a fascinating question because I think that, like I said, the medicine is not working in the West. So we need to find other ways, like what will work. So how can we get back to some of our traditional healing practices and how can we marry the two is what I hear you asking. I love that question. I love that question. So rather than just privilege one over the other, how can we take what works from the West, yeah, and what works from the East, right? Put it together and see if we can come up with a solution. Because there's a crisis. I'm actually starting an organization at my university called Yana, You're Not Alone. Anybody wants to start one in Ghana, I'm happy to help you figure it out. You're not alone, to help people deal with mental health issues, because I think mental health happens across the continuum. Right? If you're depressed one day, that's your mental state not being so hot that day. If you are depressed for months because of a relationship ending or death in the family, that's your mental health not being okay for several months until you heal. So all of us can locate ourselves at some point in time on that mental health spectrum. It should not be stigmatized. Who has not been depressed? Hold your hand up, put your hand up, whether you're online at any point in your life. Who's never had a moment where they suffered from depression, or just even if it was not clinical, but circumstantial. Your dog died, your mama died, your grandmother died, your relationship ended. Put your hand up, I want to see it. Nobody? Okay, I didn't think so. So we can all locate ourselves somewhere on that spectrum. We have all had some issues to deal with. Not everybody's going to go running naked in the street, right? But you're all dealing with issues. So if we're dealing with issues, there's a source for it, there's a reason for it. Sometimes it's personal, sometimes it's economic, which is still personal, right? Sometimes it's governmental, sometimes it's family, it's relationships, sometimes it's health. Well, we all have to deal with these issues. So how do we find approaches? I love your question. I love your question. And yes, I want us to get together and see if we can talk about how do we marry the best of both worlds so we can address some of these issues, because I think we really need to tackle this issue. It's a huge issue in my university, which is why I started the organization, because I realized students after COVID, after the pandemic period, like they stopped coming to classes, they're not turning in their work, they're not talking to their professors, everybody has kind of just dropped out. And they're dealing with issues. And then social media is this big thing where people feel they have to compete with other people who are putting on a facade. So here you have these young people who are thinking they're not good enough because they're not living up to some standard. And the standard they're trying to live up to is not a real standard. It's fake. People have fake lives on social media, and you're trying to live up to somebody's fake life. Good luck with that. Right? So these are some of the issues that we're dealing with. And it's because of that, it's become an epidemic almost, these mental health issues. And so I think the way to deal with it is to speak out, to kind of get people engaged, but also to destigmatize. And to, have the conversation and share, be vulnerable. It's okay. Nothing's gonna happen to you if you're vulnerable, if you share that you're not superhuman, right? Because none of us are, right? And so some people pray, some people take medication. I do a lot of praying, I have to admit. That's part of my coping mechanism. But I also write a lot, right? And that's part of my coping mechanism. But I literally have a brother who was shot down in Jamaica for just having schizophrenia. He was shot down and killed. So I'm very personally attached to this issue, right? Yeah.
I think we have a question online, and we have a question in the room. So do you want to take the question in the room?
Yes.
Where's our mic? Okay. Yeah, online, exactly. We have one question online and one question in the room.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Really couldn't get the best part of it, but that to go in and out.
Please, your name.
But,
Please,
but-
who are you? Your name?
oh, my name is Luangas, I'm sorry. Yes. It's interesting that you are coming from the Caribbean. I live up on the mountains, the Iguape Mountains, which is very famous for people from the Caribbean, because it kind of has the Jamaican vibe, Caribbean vibe, it's mountainous and all of that. And we have Jamaican village and all those kinds of things up there. But sadly, about a month ago, a month and a half maybe, this Jamaican woman who has been around, she repatriated from England. She's been around Ghana for a while. And interesting, we're talking about trauma and mental health. The son is a very sad story. The son who had a lot of, mental health issues, actually basically like chopped the mother to death. So and I know I don't live very far from them. I was not in Ghana at the time that this happened, but when I heard the issue, it was very, very sad. They fled the UK and, to come to Ghana because they felt that Ghana is a safe haven, to escape all the trauma and all whatever it is that happened out there. But now the trauma follows them here, and then she eventually loses her life, at the hands of her own offspring, who is kind of like carrier of the virus that is supposed to be the trauma that they were running away from. So very sad. But the other point that I wanted to make has to do with, I was listening to, at the beginning of your presentation, you spoke about how trauma is embedded in DNA and therefore can be inherited. And there's a very good book that I feel might be useful, especially for maybe reconceptualizing from a more Pan-Africanist point of view. It's a book entitled Self-Healing Power and Therapy, Self-Healing Power and Therapy, written by a Congolese guy called Kimwandende Kiabunteki Fokiao. It's a very long name, but Self-Healing Power and Therapy. And in there, he talks about this idea called Nsinga Dikanda. It's a Bakongo phrase, but it basically translates to self-healing power. Yeah, Nsinga Dikanda. No, sorry. Nsinga Dikanda translates to biogenetic growth. Biogenetic growth. And basically, the idea of the biogenetic growth or Nsinga Dikanda is analogous to the idea of the DNA and how DNA can influence or how DNA plays a role in us inheriting certain traits, certain traumas in your case, from people who we are biologically related to. So I think that the idea of Nsinga Dikanda can help in, theoretically framing your point of view from a more Pan-Africanist point of view. And then also, very generally, the book also helps unravel some of the questions that were being raised about how can we address issues of trauma, how can we arrest trauma, and then basically, get rid of it. So it talks about different African remedies, simple things, drumming and all kinds of things, and how, in African societies, people use different things that right now we may not necessarily think very deeply about, but those were the ways people used to cope with trauma and so on and so forth. So the book goes deeply into, many of those kinds of things, and how trauma relates to DNA, how trauma can be addressed, and how to manage it, overall. So I think you might want to.
I definitely do.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. We're gonna take the last question online. Anyone else in the room who hasn't already spoken, want to speak? Want to take the last question online. Amwa, do you want to open your mic and say your question? I see your mic is open.
Yes,
Go ahead.
thank you so much. Just a quick contribution to the question of integrating indigenous healing with the biomedical health system from experience and some knowledge that I've gathered. Now, there are different learnings that with some colleagues we've looked at in terms of mistrust when it comes to this, the complexity of the colonial experience. And then, trauma manifested through mistrust of ourselves, of each other. Then, of course, there's also the essentialism, which we tend to actually have within particularly the academic circles. We tend to actually block off. It's a very defense mechanism that we have. We tend to have that. Now, there's a practical example of doing this, and I think this comes from Malidoma Patrice Some from Burkina Faso in terms of how he had to unlearn. And that's the process of unlearning that I think we have to do in really healing, because that bit, it's epistemic. There's also been some recent research, and one was led by Professor Cesar Aturi in the Infantiman district, and I was involved in this on mapping out the mental health streams. Within the Ghana's health system, there are actually three main streams of healthcare. We have the indigenous healthcare, we have the biomedical healthcare, and then we have the religious-based healthcare. But the problem is that because of the coloniality of the biomedical system, the doctors and the nurses who are trained to lead the Ghana Health Service themselves are alienated from the indigenous health systems, and they do not promote these things. So with example, that research was well done, even in terms of how the biomedical system was infused with some of the traditional, the traditional systems, and then the religious-based healthcare with that. So that is something that we can all learn from or tap into post this place. I have personally been working with indigenous healers in the Bois district over the past 6 months. And that also has brought forth a lot of things in terms of notions and practices of healing against some form of epistemicide. Because what it is with the biomedical health system is that by the state, the laws, which were really through Presbyterian, Catholic, whatever, becoming part of the state's law, we've actually driven these indigenous healers, who are about 75%, 70 to 75%, cater for 70 to 75% of persons in Ghana. And they are driven, they are silenced, their knowledges are silenced. And what is happening is that as they die, we lose these knowledge. So that's a whole epistemicide that the state itself reinforces. So that's one level to actually take up. And this is some work that I've documented, issues of healing from relational perspective, from a communitarian perspective, where healers see this as an imperative, a moral imperative to heal. So we can actually look at it by unlearning the next phase, of course, of this project, because if you have somebody like the trauma that comes with emotional things, we have things within our society that have always worked, but we silence them because of the colonially inherited biomedical system and how we tend to reinforce these things. So that's the angle to also look at, perhaps in moving forward. Thank you very much. I just thought I should contribute these ideas for the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so we're going to turn it over to our speaker, who then will turn it over to our coordinator.
Thank you so much. That final point, Professor, I would like to get in touch with you so we can have
I'm a PhD student. I'm a PhD student at the Institute of African Studies. Thank you.
Student.
Yes.
Well, you sure sound like a professor to me. Well, thank you for that. I would love to connect so we can talk about that because I absolutely agree with you that it's not just here in Africa, but in my part of the world as well, where we do silence those healers. And part of it has to do with our fears and Christianity and how we like that piece of it as well is a piece that I didn't bring up in this conversation, but that's a piece of it where there is this fear of traditional healers being tied to traditional religion. Yeah, I think that's a piece of it. And so we find ourselves kind of alienated and the from each other and from the sources of healing that could really work because we're no longer in conversation or because we think certain people are a danger or we're fearful, right? Sometimes fearful for no good reason. I also want to thank the gentleman in the room who, and please stick around if you will. I'd love to continue the conversation with you privately. And I'm really sorry about what happened. That's such a tragedy that this woman brought her son here trying to get away from the trauma of the West. But of course, you bring your trauma with you, and that's the point. Like you can't escape it. You can't just run away from it, right? You bring it with you, and that's why we need to deal with it. Because maybe she thought just coming to Africa would have been enough, but he was already he already had those issues before he came here. You know, and maybe they didn't seek out the ways to fix them because we're also in denial. We're also so much in denial. That could have been avoided, I think. That maybe is something that could have been avoided. But because we're not looking at it the way that we should, and we're not addressing it the way that we should, these kinds of things can happen. So I hope that now that the family is here, that they're also seeking out ways to deal with these issues, because if it is in the DNA, then he might not be the only one who has that issue. What happened with him? I'm just curious, maybe.
So I understand that, so when the incident.
Can you go down to people online and also hear you?
Yeah, so when the incident took place, he was arrested, of course. So it is something that they knew existed, because I understand he was even at the something place for psychiatric, yeah. So he was there for a while, and I think he was on medication. And just like you were saying, his Western medicine do not necessarily work.
Yeah.
So he tried to do it, and then people stopped him. And then I think about a week or so later, like not long after his first attempt, and he did it again, actually on Mother's Day. Yeah, so he did it on Mother's Day. And afterwards, the police arrested him, and then the rest of the family in the UK, they did a funeral on the 23rd or so of June, and they said that they would take him, fortunately, back to the UK, you know, to do whatever they have to do in order to address the situation. Yeah.
And thank you for that. That's just so sad. Yeah, but that's a case in point. I'm really glad you spoke up about that. And I'm very interested in finding out about the book. I didn't write down the author's name, so hopefully you can write it down for me so I can pursue that, because that's a really good connection. But I noticed I'm missing a question, right? Sanira wanted me to speak as a Black woman. How do I feel that gender impacts all of this? And I'm really glad you asked that question. I'm really glad you asked the question, Sanira, because there's so much that I didn't get to talk about in the paper because of time constraints. But we're talking about intersectionality now. So that is something that our scholars have been talking about. Audrey Lorde talked about it, Bell Hooks, our Black feminist scholars in the United States have been talking about how you can't just look at race and you can't just look at gender, you have to look at both. And then combined, they create certain conditions, right? When you combine race and gender, Kimberly Crenshaw has a really good definition of it. So you can look it up, intersectionality according to Kimberly Crenshaw, where she talks about when you combine those identifiers that are both marginalized. And if you add a third one, like homosexuality or poverty or whatever, right? When you add one on top of the other, what you get is a person who has maybe bigger issues than somebody with just one, right? Of those issues. Now, the way we look at things from the Caribbean perspective, we don't really look at feminism alone. We also look at masculinity. So we look at gender rather than just women's issues. We look at gender issues. So you always have to look at the intersectionality, because, for example, a very upper middle class woman in the Caribbean might have it better than her gardener, even though the gardener is a man. So he's gonna have certain advantages being a man, like certain things he can get away with, certain advantages as a man that a woman doesn't have, but she's gonna have certain advantages because of her class. So you see what I'm saying? You have to look at these issues in a complex way, right? And when you look at them in that complex, it's really important to do so because you cannot come up with effective solutions if you're looking at one side of the problem. Because what if you're only looking at racism, but I'm being abused at home by my husband? What do we do about that? Racism, fixing racism isn't gonna fix that, right? So that's why intersectionality is an important concept, because you have to look at the individual. What are the issues this individual is having? What are the particularities of this individual's identity that might shape certain issues and then address it that way, so that you can actually come up with real solutions that work, right? Rather than just concepts in your head that sound good, but on the ground may not do anything for anyone, right? So you always have to look at class, you have to look at sexuality, you have to look at race, you have to look at gender, and you have to look at the intersection of all of those issues when you're trying to address these problems. So that for a woman, the biggest problem could be domestic violence. Although the overarching problem of race is always there, her biggest, most immediate need right now might be to get away from this crazy person. Same thing if it's a man who's been abused. Men usually don't talk about it, but it does happen too, the opposite way, right? That might be the biggest issue. So you have to address that issue. So I think it's really important to understand these concepts and to understand how they can be applicable in the real world, so that when you're looking for solutions, you're looking for solutions that can actually work. Because there are a lot of things we've come up with that just simply do not work. They're just not effective. Senora, does that answer your question? And I'm thinking, is there another one? More comments. Okay. So thank you all so much. Yes, yes. So we're going to be sharing my contact information. My lovely mentee developed all this beautiful social media stuff that I know nothing about. That I will try to figure out. And yeah, and so I will follow all of these and I'll make sure I respond to any questions you have. But there are some folks who spoke today that I would really like to continue the conversation. You know who you are. Please reach out through these forums that are on here so that we can continue this conversation. Oh, I also want to announce my poetry reading at Loa Tad in Adenta, Accra, at 3 p.m. on Saturday, this Saturday. Thank you so much, Seth, and I'm so glad you're here in the audience with us. And lastly, I just want to thank the Institute so much. I want to thank you both for being here with me. I want to thank you for going out of your way to accommodate me. I know that you did, and I really appreciate it. It does not go unnoticed. It is a pleasure to be here. This is my very first time in Ghana. As I said, I have Ghana DNA from Ghana and Nigeria. I've been to Nigeria. I'm really happy to be here in Ghana. I'm really happy to get to know some of you, to talk to you, and like we said, break bread in the Caribbean. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for turning out. Thank you for your wonderful, amazing questions. And this session has been full of information for me, right? It's been very informative. This is exactly what I was hoping would happen when I got here. And I am so appreciative. You wouldn't know. Thank you all so much.
All right. Yeah, I think your DNA is more Ghanaian. So, but that's one we have to show you. And I take the opportunity to say very big thank you for this very thought-provoking and very practical presentation. We could all relate to it in our personal lives and in what we read. All our course. Thank you very much. And we expect to see you again. Anytime you come, please come to the Institute. We will host you for another wonderful.
Thank you so much. I will remember that.
And Sanjiva, thank you for sitting in for today's seminar. And to everyone in house, we say a very big thank you. And for those of us online, it's another big thank you as usual. Next week, we don't have a seminar. So next week we have a break. Someone. Next week we have a break, but there is a conference that is coming on Thursday next week. I think it's the whole of next week. That is why we are breaking for the seminar. So please join the conference. It also promises to be something very exciting. But on 20th, we will meet here and also online. So make time to join us as usual. Thank you. And I think on 20th, that will be our last seminar. Yes, then we could have a break. So thank you to everyone and see you on 20th. Bye-bye.